I'm Davy. I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. So this week I'm going to be reviewing a documentary series that I've been wanting to review for a while now. But I'm only going to do the first half in this one. We'll do the second half some other day. This documentary series started in October 2014 and ran until June 2015. And was mostly directed by Kevin Dunn and narrated by Keith David. The documentary series, The Monday Night Wars, WWE Vs WCW. Even though in my opinion a more fitting title would have been WWF versus WCW, they have the rights to say WWF now because that's what they were, and they didn't become WWE until after WCW was gone. So, whatever. That's my only rant on that. Episode 1, The War Begins. It talks about the beginning of when WWF was like the big game in town. WCW was still very regional. In fact, it was still part of the NWA till it was bought out by Ted Turner. And when he bought it out and it officially became WCW, he was bringing in people to run it. They just really didn't know how, so it was very confusing. The worst of whom he brought in was Jim Herd, which I'm finding a section of fans nowadays trying to go like, oh, Jim Herd wasn't that bad. He was that bad. Nobody who worked under Jim Herd has anything nice to say about him. But it was when Turner brought in Eric Bischoff to run the company, and one of the first things he came up with was a show to go head-to-head with Monday Night Raw, Monday Nitro. It also talks about how Eric Bischoff played dirty. For example, because Monday Nitro was live and Raw was pre-taped, he'd give away the results on Monday Nitro. I will say this from my personal perspective. People go like, oh, that kind of ruined it because people didn't want to watch WWF anymore. I still did. It's one reason I refused to watch Monday Nitro when it aired live. I'd tape it and watch it the next day, because that used to piss me off when he would do that. The second episode, The Rise of the NWO, which of course talks about the formation of the NWO. WCW's biggest idea that they ran with for way too long. But basically how Scott Hall was offered a guaranteed contract, which WWF did not do at the time. So he went to WCW. Nash followed with another guaranteed contract, a big contract, and how they were coming out basically playing the same character, but nobody was saying their names, so WWE was suing over gimmick infringement. And I remember being a fan around that time, being like 11, 12 years old, and actually thinking that it was a WWE invasion. So I will admit, it worked. It got me watching WCW on a weekly basis. For a little bit. But basically the NWO was cool, it was edgy, and eventually it made WWE realize they had to get away from the cartoonish gimmicks. They had to get away from the Doink the Clowns and the Duke the Dumpster Drosies and the TL Hoppers and get into some edgy, realistic product. Episode 3, Embracing Attitude. Basically like they talked about in the second one, WWE came to the realization, we got to get more edgy. So what came of it was the Attitude Era. But of course at the time what people didn't understand was WWE was working towards that already, but you can't really just completely change overnight. You got to cater to the audience you have while slowly changing things, gaining a new audience, so that when some of that audience goes away, you still have an audience. Because that is a thing that did happen. There were people who around the Attitude Era stopped watching because they liked the gimmicky cartoon stuff. Point in case, in other videos I've talked about how I got into wrestling with my aunt and her family. They stopped watching wrestling around the Attitude Era. They didn't like it at all. They liked the campy, cartoonish gimmicks. But one of the first things to start the Attitude Era was the infamous Brian Pillman segment. The one where Austin had been attacking him, even went to his home, and Brian, in response to Austin 3:16, pulled out Pillman 9mm Glock. But of course, because it got such high ratings, it led to them taking more and more chances, building up new stars like Austin, building up D-Generation X. It led to them also doing a lot of sexual stuff. You know, the beginning of the Divas, before they were called Divas, basically coming out every week in thongs, having bra and panty matches, and mud wrestlings. And also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention The Rock, Mankind, all these other personalities that came out with that edgy WWE attitude. As far as DX, of course they had to have Eric Bischoff in here throw out that he felt like it was a ripoff of the NWO. Yet my personal feeling is, no, it wasn't. It was very different. Shawn Michaels talked about it as like the NWO was like a gang and these were just a couple of degenerates having fun. Like DX wasn't taking over, they were just causing chaos. But because of this Attitude Era thing and it gaining the momentum it did, which eventually shifted WWE back into being the number one, WCW tried to compete with them by trying to be a little bit more edgy, but they couldn't. They were on Turner Broadcasting, which wouldn't allow it. So basically the only real edgy thing they had was the NWO, and it was getting tired. From here in the docuseries, this is where they stop really talking about the overall war and just start focusing on certain things in the war, certain people, characters, and stuff that happened that made the Monday Night War iconic. Starting with episode 4, A New Degeneration, talking about the rise of Degeneration X. Talking about Shawn and at the time Hunter Hearst Helmsley forming Degeneration X, which was just a faction of the two of them and Chyna and Rick Rude at first. But just how both of them were very rebellious people, wanted an edgier product and were doing it, and sometimes going a little too far. But the farther they went, the higher the ratings got. In the course of this, Shawn Michaels, in his casket match against The Undertaker, he got hurt and had to leave WWE for 5 years because of a broken back. So instead of DX dying, Triple H became the leader of Degeneration X and formed a new Degeneration X with his buddy X-Pac, who had just come over from WCW as 6, and the New Age Outlaws. And they talked about their feuds with other factions like the Nation of Domination and invading WCW, which we all remember, and, well, it was just some damn good television. 5th episode, Have a Nice Day, focusing on one of my all-time favorites, Mick Foley, a.k.a. Mankind, a.k.a. Dude Love, a.k.a. Cactus Jack. It started with them talking about Foley being in WCW as Cactus Jack and just really going nowhere because they didn't really see much in him. So he decided to leave, where he made a name for himself on the independents and showed what he could do when he was unrestrained, but still as Cactus Jack, but then coming into WWE and then wanting to make him Mankind. Well, not Mankind. Apparently first they wanted to call him Mason the Mutilator, and then he came up with Mankind the Mutilator and eventually convinced them to just drop it to just Mankind. But it worked and it was good, and from basically the time he showed up and was feuding with The Undertaker, he was the top heel in the company. And I remember there was a time when it was clearly stated and true that no one had more victories over The Undertaker than Mankind. But then what kind of made the momentum shift of Mankind from being a dastardly heel to a babyface was the Jim Ross interviews, where they went into his backstory of being a fan and doing the Dude Love segments with the video snippets we've all seen from his homemade videos of jumping off of his roof. And because of her, a while, he got to be Dude Love, which I remember was thinking really cool, but figured it was never really going to go very far. Which it didn't. He had a couple of championship matches as Dude Love, but that was about it. And on to his most famous match of his career, the Hell in the Cell. It's funny when I talk about Mankind's Hell in the Cell match, and everybody instantly knows what I'm talking about. The one where he was thrown off the top of the cage onto the announce table, and then later thrown through the top of the cage onto the mat. It is still to this day the match he is most remembered for, and a match that afterwards Vince McMahon said, "I appreciate what you did for the company, but don't ever do that again." And how this led to one of the most unlikely people ever in the history of wrestling becoming the WWE World Heavyweight Champion. On 3 occasions. Never very long occasions, but 3 occasions. But his iconic feuds with The Rock, Triple H, and of course one of the funnest tag teams that ever came about, the Rock and Sock Connection. The 6th episode, Heart of War, where we told the story of Bret Hart that we've all heard time and time again. One of the things starting the Attitude Era being the feud between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, which was not just an on-camera feud, but a real-life feud. How it started professional, but got very personal. Like Bret not believing Shawn's knee injury that made him relinquish the title, and Shawn going on the air and accusing Bret Hart of having an affair with WWE diva Sunny. And of course, this leading to the Montreal Screwjob, something that we are still talking about all these years later. Because Vince was basically pushing Bret Hart out because he wasn't getting on board with the direction the company was going in. But Bret didn't want to drop the title, especially not to Shawn. And they couldn't let him not drop the title. That would have made WWE look very weak, especially because they were worried that Bret Hart was going to go on WCW television and throw the title in the trash, like Alundra Blaze had done. And of course, it did get the opinion of some of the insiders, like Paul Heyman, who ran a company at one point, ECW, and said that he agreed with what Vince McMahon did. He had to protect his company. Me, personally, I don't like to talk much about the Montreal Screwjob because what else am I going to bring to the table that hasn't been said? But when people do ask me, do I think it was Bret's fault? Do I think it was Shawn's fault? Do I think it was Vince's fault? My answer, yes. But then Bret Hart going into WCW, and despite the fact that WWE basically handed them a story on a silver platter, they had no idea what to do with Bret Hart. Which again is one of the reasons I couldn't stand WCW, because that was given to you on a silver platter, and you still screwed it up. And of course Eric Bischoff defending himself like, oh, Bret Hart wasn't really all that into it. Because, in my opinion, because you never gave him anything for him to really sink his teeth into. And of course in WCW, him getting injured by Goldberg, which ended his career. But they also did throw in how, almost 20 years later, finally got the closure of coming back to WWE, making amends with Shawn, and it ended on a good note. Episode 7, The War Gets Extreme, which is basically just the story of ECW. ECW during the Monday Night Wars, they were doing their thing, an independent little promotion, but were definitely influencing the big companies. I don't really have that much to say about this episode because, truthfully, if you have seen the rise and fall of ECW or read the book, or really even seen any documentary about ECW, then this brings nothing new to it. It's basically the exact same story. The only difference is this one is not focusing so much on the story of ECW as its influence on the bigger companies. But again, really nothing you haven't already seen 100,000 times by now. Then episode 8, the Austin era has begun. The story of Stone Cold Steve Austin. How he started in WCW as Stunning Steve Austin, was gaining momentum, but then Hogan came in and he got pushed to the back burner, and he admits he was very upset about this. He felt underappreciated, so he was becoming difficult to work with, and while he was out on injury, he was fired. But then immediately went to ECW and started cutting promos mostly because he couldn't wrestle much. He was still injured. And that was a big deal in his career because it helped him work on promos, which was one thing he was kind of lacking as Stunning Steve Austin. But then getting the call from WWF that they wanted him to come in as the Ringmaster. And there was a part in this where John Cena said nobody remembers the Ringmaster. I do. Ultimately, though, people talk about the Ringmaster like it was embarrassing and stupid. It wasn't really that bad of a gimmick. It just wasn't a good gimmick either. It was, okay, you're the Ringmaster. So what? But after trying it out for a little bit, he wanted a new character, and he wanted a character based off of something that was hot in the news at the time, which was Richard Kuklinski, who was a real-life mafia hitman called the Iceman because of his very cold demeanor. And he went into the story of telling this to WWE Creative and them giving him a list of ideas for names, and he mentioning the 3 worst names on the list: Otto Von Ruthless, Ice Dagger, and Fang McFrost. But he didn't mention the one that was my personal favorite on that list when it later got out, Chili McFreeze. But it was thanks to his wife at the time, who was a British woman. She made him a cup of tea, told him, "You'll figure it out, but drink your tea before it gets stone cold. There's your name." And Stone Cold Steve Austin was born. And of course went into the iconic moments that really made him, like the first one being when he came up with Austin 316 at the King of the Ring, the WrestleMania 13 I Quit match where he lost, but it definitely put him over because he lost by passing out. Then things that kind of derailed his momentum a little bit, like the SummerSlam match with Owen Hart where he broke his neck, but then coming back, winning the title at WrestleMania 14, feuding with Vince McMahon, which in my opinion is probably the biggest feud that ever took place. Like, there's been some pretty good, interesting, iconic feuds out there, but I don't think any of them top that one. WCW's response to him by creating Goldberg, who was helping WCW for a time, but Austin was still bigger. His feuds with The Rock and Triple H, and how they were able to take the reins when he was sidelined with injuries, even went all the way up to his retirement because of injuries. But still, I would say in the Attitude Era, he was definitely the biggest character, and arguably the biggest character to ever be around in wrestling, period. And then episode 9, one of my personal favorites in the docuseries, Flight of the Cruiserweights. It was something they touched on a little bit in the documentary The Rise and Fall of WCW, where that was like WCW's other really great idea, the Cruiserweights, which I will admit was the main thing that kept me watching for a while. The NWO was cool and all, but it got boring fast, in my opinion. The Cruiserweights was always awesome. And of course, the popularity of the Cruiserweights brought in the Cruiserweight Championship. Still one of my favorite belts of all time. Of course, profiled some of the big names in the Cruiserweight division like Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Rey Mysterio, Chris Jericho. And it was getting so popular that WWE tried to bring back the light heavyweight division. And it didn't work. And they said it was because they didn't have the talent that WCW had. I don't know about that because they had some pretty talented people. I just don't think they knew what to do with them. Like they had Brian Christopher, which later went on to be Grandmaster Sexay, and Scott Too Hot Taylor, who went on to be Scotty Too Hottie, who went on to form the tag team with Brian Christopher of Scotty Too Hottie and Grandmaster Sexay, Too Cool. They had Taka Michinoku. So they had great wrestlers in the light heavyweight division, but WWE, even on up to the last Cruiserweight division they had, the NXT Cruiserweight division, they've never known what to do with a Cruiserweight division. They can do things with Cruiserweight wrestlers, but not a division. But even WCW didn't really know what to do with them. They put them out there, but none of these guys were ever able to climb the ladder. They never got to where we wanted to see them, which I will admit, as much as I love the cruiserweights, even I got bored of them. Because how many times can you watch the same 5 guys wrestle each other? Not to mention, you would be watching and hoping that this person would later get somewhere, and they never did. And that not only gets boring, it gets frustrating, and you change the channel. Then episode 10, which is the last one we're going to talk about today, Who's Next? The story of Goldberg. How he was an NFL player, and then once his NFL career was done, he needed something new to do. He wasn't like a 9-to-5er, so he went to try out wrestling, went into the WCW power plant where they trained him for a couple months. And after only a couple of months of training, his debut, where he just went out there and squashed somebody in less than a minute, which became his thing. And it worked at first, he never said a word. He just went out there, spear, jackhammer, matched over, built up a streak. That was ridiculous. Because literally, if you were doing the math, it would be like how his streak would be like this high this Monday Nitro, and then the very next Monday Nitro, it's so high that it would have been like, so are you telling us that in between there he wrestled 15 shows? And they said that nobody noticed, but yes, we did. I remember having conversations with my friends about it. And of course, they went into the infamous Goldberg versus Steven Regal match, where they said Regal was taking liberties with him, but I really don't think he was. I think he was just trying to do the best he could. They wanted a 6-minute match out of Goldberg, and he wasn't equipped for that. Which is eventually what led to Goldberg's downfall, because after the streak ended, now what? Because he couldn't go out and have, good matches. Couldn't go out there and have, classic 20-minute main event matches. He wasn't built for that. They didn't take the time to train him for it. It did also go into WWE's response of Gilberg, which was just funny. Come on. But then again, the misuse of Goldberg. After he injured his arm, punching it through a window, and came back from his injury, nobody really cared, because it was just the same thing we'd always seen before. Kind of the same thing with the NWO. We got to a point we didn't care anymore because it was the same thing we'd been seeing over and over and over again. So it eventually fizzled out. So there you have it. That's the first 10 episodes of the Monday Night War docuseries. I'll get to the overall review when we do the second episode where we finish it out, but my overall feeling about it is most of what you're seeing on this is stuff we've already seen 100,000 times. However, there are some new perspectives because they're bringing in the superstars that were around at that time in 2014. Not to mention, even the ones that were around during the Monday Night Wars, we're getting more of their perspectives. But it goes from the first 3 episodes of really just encompassing the Monday Night War to episode after episode of people who were involved in the Monday Night War. But again, if you're a wrestling fan and you've seen documentaries about them before, which you probably have, it's not bringing a whole lot new to the table. So that's my overall feeling about it for the first 10 episodes. We'll get into my overall feelings on the entire docuseries when we do episode 11 through 20, finishing it out in the future. So yeah, but that's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notifications when I post new videos, and leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of the first 10 episodes of the Monday Night Wars. Love you guys.